Hello, my name is Brandon Bob, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Group 7 today. This is our presentation for project number 3, which is based on the game of rock, paper, scissors. Today I'll be presenting our pseudocode along with our flowchart. So I'll just get right into it and start off with our pseudocode. The first thing that we would do is set our variables, which would be rock, paper, scissors, and then we would also set player scores, player 1 and player 2 scores. After that's done, we would start. So set rock, which would be represented by a fist, set paper, which would be represented by a straight flat hand, and then set scissors, which would be represented by spreading your index and second finger apart, mocking scissors. We would then set variables for each player's score, which would be points 1, which equals to player's 1 score, and points 2, which equals to player's 2 score. Both scores would be set to 0, so points 1 equals 0 and points 2 equals 0. And then we would both simultaneously count to 3 and then reveal our hands. If player 1 was to show rock and player 2 was to show rock, this would be a tie game, and then we would refer back to step 7, which would be to simultaneously count to 3 and then show our hands again. If player 1 was to show rock and player 2 was to show paper, then we would add 1 to variables points 1. And if player 1 was to show rock and player 2 was to show scissors, we would add 1 to variable points 2. Now, if player 1 was to show paper, this would be a different scenario here, of course. So if player 1 was to show paper and player 2 was to show paper, once again, it would be a tie game. We refer back to step 7, which we both simultaneously count to 3 and reveal our hands again. Now, if player 1 was to reveal paper and player 2 was to reveal rock, then we would add 1 to variable points 1. And if player 1 was to show rock and player 2 was to show scissors, then we would add 1 to variable points 2. And in the final scenario, it would be if player 1 was to show scissors. So if they were to show both player 1 and 2 were to show scissors, then it'd be a tie game. And once again, we refer back to step 7. If player 1 shows scissors and player 2 shows paper, we would add 1 to variables points 1. And if the player 1 was to show scissors and player 2 was to show rocks, we would add 1 to variable points 2. And then in this step here, it would be, should the variable points 1 be greater than points 2, then player 1 wins. And should the variable points 2 be greater than points 1, player 2 wins. Now in task 2 of our pseudocode, we'll be mapping objects to numbers that will be chosen by a random function. So we start off by setting integer 1, which would be equal to rock, setting integer 2, which would be equal to paper, and setting integer 3, which would be equal to scissor. We would then create a function called random yield integer, which will display a randomized choice between integer 1 and integer 3 for both players. We would then simultaneously count to 3 and call the function random yield integer. If player 1 shows rock and player 2 shows rock, then it's a tie game, and we'll refer once again to step 7. If player 1 shows rock and player 2 shows integer 2, which would be paper, we add 1 to the variable points 1. If player 1 was to show rock and player 2 was to show integer 3, which would be scissors, we add 1 to variable points 2. And the second scenario would be if player 1 was to show paper. So if player 1 was to show paper and player 2 was to show paper, then it would be a tie. We refer back to step 7 again, which would be to simultaneously count and reveal, simultaneously count to 3 and reveal our hands again. But if player 1 shows paper and player 2 shows integer 1, which would be rock, we add 1 to the variable points 1. And if player 1 shows paper once again, we would show, and player 2 was to show integer 3, which would be scissors, we add 1 to variable points 2. Now the final scenario in terms of task 2, which would be if player 1 was to show scissors. If player 1 was to show scissors and player 2 was to show scissors, it would be once again a tie game, and we refer back to step 7, which would to start the game over again. If player 1 was to show scissors and player 2 was to show integer 2, which would be paper, we add 1 to variables points 1. And if player 1 was to show scissors and player 2 was to show integer 3, we add 1 to variable points 2. Should the variable points 1 be greater than points 2, player 1 wins, and if the variable points 2 is greater than points 1, player 2 wins. In terms of task 3 of the pseudocode, we would set the input of rock to we set the input to equal to rock, then input to equal to paper, and then input to equal to scissors. Variables for each player's score would be set to points 1 equals player 1, points 2 equals player 2. The score for each player would be set to 0, so points 1 equals 0, points 2 equals 0 as well. Player 1 and 2 reveal hands and then count to 3. So did player 1 and player 2 show the same hand? If they did show the same hand, then it would be a tie game. Otherwise, it would be no, and we can continue to step 1. In the case of a tie, player 1 and 2 want to play another game. If it's a yes, then we start another game, revealing our hands at the count of 3. Otherwise, if it's no, we would then tally up the points. So should the variable points 1 be greater than points 2, player 1 wins. If the variable for points 2 is greater than points 1, player 2 wins. And then we would end the game at that point. So this would be it for our pseudocode. Now moving towards our flow chart. And here it is. So how this would work is you would start off the game. You'd synchronize 2 players before their choice of rock, paper, or scissors. Players will move their fists 3 times in synchronosis fashion, then reveal their play. Players reveal their play, rock, paper, or scissors. So if player 1 and 2 reveal the same play, it's a tie round, and they restart the game. Now if that's no, then we determine who the winner is. So if player 1 reveals rock and player 2 reveals paper, then player 2 wins the round, and then we can either choose to go to the next round, which would be to restart the game, or we can choose to no longer play and end the game. If player 1 was to reveal rock and player 2 was to reveal scissors, player 1 wins the round, and once again we get the choice to restart and play again or end the game. Now if player 1 was to choose paper and player 2 was to choose scissors, player 1 will win this round. If player 1 was to reveal paper and player 2 was to reveal rock, player 2 would win this round. In both these scenarios, we'd either go to the next round, choosing to restart the game, or we would choose to end the game. And the final scenario would be player 1 reveals scissors. If player 2 reveals paper, then player 1 wins the round. If player 1 reveals scissors and player 2 reveals rock, player 2 wins the round. And once again, in both these scenarios, we either choose to go to the next round, or we choose to end the game. That is our presentation for project number 3 for group 7. Hope you yourselves a great day, and thank you.